October 27, 1962. Two world superpowers, equipped with over 4,000 nuclear warheads in total, are flirting with a dangerous escalation of what had so far been a Cold War, one fought without direct confrontation. Both the US and USSR have placed missiles in third-party countries close to each other's borders, pointed directly at enemy soil. In this critical moment, two events happen on the same day. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane is shot down over Cuba, where the Soviet missile bases have been built up, and Kennedy is urged to retaliate militarily directly against the Soviets. Meanwhile, American warships drop depth charges to force a Soviet B-59 submarine to surface. The submarine's officers are unaware that they're violating a U.S. naval blockade and interpret the maneuvers of the U.S. warships as an act of war. What the Americans don't know is that Soviet submarine being threatened is carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Had two men made different decisions, that could have easily been the day the world exploded into nuclear war. Why didn't it? To understand the actions taken in the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's crucial to take a quick look back a couple of years at U.S., Cuban, and Soviet relations. Since the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. had increasingly asserted its power and influence over the Western Hemisphere. With the Soviet bloc declared an ideological enemy, the U.S. was especially vigilant about communism penetrating the West. This sphere of influence would be tested in 1959, when young revolutionary Fidel Castro took power in Cuba after waging a guerrilla war against U.S.-backed military dictator Fulgencio Batista. He quickly converted the nation to communism, further angering U.S. politicians who were engaged in political conflict and arms race with the most powerful communist nation of all at the time. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the U.S. president at the time, deemed Castro's administration in Cuba unacceptable. Initially, his idea was simple. The CIA would train 1,400 Cuban exiles in the U.S., sympathetic to the old government and angry at Castro, to invade Cuba and win the country back. The plan was hatched under Eisenhower in 1960. By the time it was ready, the charismatic John F. Kennedy was president of the U.S. Kennedy had second and third and fourth thoughts about the planned invasion. The strategy of sending in Cuban exiles had come about to, first, make it seem like it wasn't a U.S. government invasion of Cuba, and second, to keep the invading groups small and clandestine so they could infiltrate the island nation and win the support of even more anti-Castro Cubans. Kennedy worried that the group was too small to be militarily effective and too large to be kept secret. However, on April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion was launched. The result was embarrassing. The U.S. government had severely underestimated Castro's forces and severely overestimated Cuban nostalgia for a U.S. puppet government on the island. Within 24 hours, the U.S.-trained Cuban exiles had been defeated, and Kennedy's administration was humiliated. Nevertheless, the effort to dismantle Castro's regime continued with foiled assassination attempts throughout the year. Even though many top U.S. officials advised Kennedy that Cuba wasn't much of a threat to the U.S. at all, Kennedy had told voters he would be tough on communism, and in politics, appearances matter most. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted to assist the newly formed communist government in Cuba against U.S. interference, while also looking for a possible bargaining chip to gain influence in West Berlin. As he said, we had to establish a tangible and effective deterrent to American interference in the Caribbean. But why exactly? The logistical answer was missiles. In addition, USSR and U.S. nuclear capabilities were vastly different at the time, and Khrushchev sought to bridge the gap. Physicist Pavel Podvig pointed out that Soviet bombers could deliver about 270 nuclear weapons to U.S. territory, while the U.S. had thousands of warheads and almost 2,000 missile delivery systems, 1,576 strategic air command bombers, 183 Atlas and Titan ICBMs, 144 Polaris missiles on nuclear submarines, and 10 Minuteman ICBMs. The Soviets, in contrast, had good medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, though relatively unreliable ICBMs, aka intercontinental ballistic missiles. Placing weapons in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida, would give the USSR a more reliable attack system against the US. After all, the US had already placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey, pointed at the USSR, so Khrushchev figured missiles in Cuba would be an effective response. From July to October of 1962, the Soviets started secretly transporting troops and equipment to Cuba. Though the operation was hardly a secret from Cuban civilians, 41,902 soldiers were deployed unconvincingly disguised as agricultural specialists, while at one point Marshal Sergei Biryusov suggested disguising the missiles as palm trees. The CIA wouldn't discover the nuclear plot until October, as it had withdrawn most of its presence after the Bay of Pigs. Though the US had noticed a Soviet military buildup in Cuba, it was on October 14, 1962 that U-2 spy plane pilot Major Richard Heiser photographed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled. This started the clock on one of the most tense, harrowing periods in US history. The next day, Kennedy sees the photos and calls his closest advisors to a meeting in order to discuss US options. He forms a group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short, consisting of 5 close advisors and 9 members of the National Security Council. Suggestions thrown out in the meeting are all over the map, ranging from a stern warning to the Soviet Union and Cuba to an airstrike and outright invasion of the island. Kennedy, ignoring his hawkish Joint Chiefs of Staff, reflecting on humiliating previous interventions in Cuba, and rightly considering that a direct attack and invasion may lead to disaster, chooses another path. He decides the US will conduct a naval blockade of the island, although he calls it a quarantine instead. Why a quarantine? Because a blockade is technically an act of war, and this one-word difference would actually further escalate the situation. JFK dictates a letter to Khrushchev announcing that the US will not permit Soviet shipments of weapons to Cuba. The president further demands that the Soviet Union dismantle the current Cuban missile bases and return all weapons to Moscow. That night, Kennedy makes a serious public announcement regarding the crisis to the US public. On national television, he says, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." The same day, the Joint Chiefs of Staff upgrades the U.S. military readiness status to DEFCON 3. Not full readiness yet, but increased vigilance with the Air Force ready to mobilize within 15 minutes. While Kennedy is taking this bold, powerful stance in front of the American people, another discussion entirely is taking place behind closed doors in EXCOM meetings. Special Counsel Theodore Sorensen, articulating the views of the EXCOM board, writes the following memo regarding the Soviet missiles in Cuba. It is generally agreed that these missiles, even when fully operational, do not significantly alter the balance of power, i.e. they do not significantly increase the potential megatonnage capable of being unleashed on American soil, even after a surprise American nuclear strike. The Soviets already had missiles capable of attacking the U.S. from longer distances. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara points out the obvious in EXCOM meetings. A missile is a missile. It makes no great difference whether you're killed by a missile from the Soviet Union or Cuba. The fact that the longer-range missiles were somewhat more unreliable didn't mean much in the long run. The U.S. is a pretty big target to hit. However, the Kennedy administration knows that optics are important, and after the humiliating events of the last 2 years in Cuba, the US cannot afford to look weak in the face of an aggressive Soviet act. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Khrushchev receives Kennedy's letter and sees his television appearance announcing the quarantine. On October 24th, Khrushchev comes back with a response of his own. The Soviet leader calls a spade, or rather a blockade, and dubs it an act of aggression on the part of the US. However, even while Khrushchev publicly condemns the US's actions, he is unwilling to have weapon-carrying ships breach the US quarantine line. Soviet ships are turned back by the US except for a few carrying no weapons. The tensions between the two Cold War superpowers are being felt all around the world. China starts publicly announcing its support of Cuba, while the citizens of West Berlin fear their freedom will end up trampled in any Soviet-US conflict. Though Khrushchev is unwilling to breach the quarantine line, more U.S. spy planes inform Kennedy that the Soviets' missile site on Cuba is still being worked on and almost ready. Seeing that his calls to dismantle the site have gone unheeded, Kennedy and his administration upgrade the readiness status of Strategic Air Command to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1, the highest level of military readiness, including its nuclear forces, has in fact never been called for in U.S. history. So the upgrade to DEFCON 2, meaning war is imminent, underscores the grave nature of the crisis. On October 26th, Kennedy starts seriously considering the option of a U.S. invasion in Cuba and a direct strike on the missile site. Predicting that this will cause global mayhem, he wants to give his diplomatic option more time to work. While facing extreme pressure from both Congress and EXCOM to take military action, that same evening, around 2 a.m. Moscow time, Khrushchev sends a long, emotional message to Kennedy in which he details his fears of the current situation resulting in nuclear apocalypse. In a private, heartfelt letter to the U.S. president, the Soviet leader writes, "If there is no intention to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this." Khrushchev promises to remove the missiles in exchange for a simple U.S. assurance that they will not invade Cuba. However, the next day, on October 27th, Khrushchev, apparently over whatever dark night of the soul caused him to reach out to Kennedy the night before, goes back on his conciliatory stance. In a much more harshly worded and unfortunately public letter, he indicates that any deal must include the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey in order to be accepted by the USSR. Furthermore, another military action forces the U.S. closer than ever to war with the USSR. Soviets tracking an American U-2 spy plane conducting a reconnaissance mission over Cuba become increasingly concerned that the U.S. will learn too much as the pilot spends well over an hour near secret locations of Soviet nuclear weapons. Even though only the commanding general is supposed to authorize a surface-to-air missile launch, he is nowhere to be found. Lieutenant General Stepan Greco gives the order to shoot down the plane instead. 2 missiles are fired. One of them manages to find its target, bringing down the plane and killing U.S. pilot Rudolph Anderson. A hush falls over Kennedy's meeting with his team as the killing of Anderson reaches their ears. Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Nitze remarks they fired the first shot. To everyone in the room, war now seems inevitable. In Moscow, Khrushchev hears of the attack and starts to realize the situation is quickly careening out of control. As he would state later in life, the Soviet premier had mostly wanted to make the US learn just what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you. We'd be doing nothing more than giving them a little of their own medicine. It was never his intention to come so close to nuclear war, a possibility which now seems increasingly likely and is about to become an even closer call. At the same time that the two leaders are deciding their next move, there's a problem at the quarantine line. The US Navy is dropping a series of signaling depth charges close to a Soviet B-59 submarine to force it to surface. Unbeknownst to them, the submarine is equipped with a nuclear-tipped torpedo, one that it has orders to use if the submarine is fired on. Unfortunately, the submarine has been too deep in the ocean for too long to know the current status of the crisis. Captain Valentin Grigorovich Savitsky assumes the charges being dropped on the B-59 are an attack and that the US and USSR are already at war. He makes the decision to launch the torpedo. However, all 3 officers on board need to sign off on the decision to launch a nuclear weapon from the submarine. One man, Vasily Arkhipov, holds out, believing the situation might be a misunderstanding. The torpedo remains unlaunched and a nuclear strike is once again very narrowly averted. Back in D.C., with the news of the U-2 plane being shot down all over the White House, Kennedy's advisors are clamoring for revenge. They urge Kennedy to launch a retaliatory attack the next morning. Kennedy, however, correctly suspects that Khrushchev did not authorize this airstrike against a U.S. plane. He's still hesitant to take military action. As he explains to the advisors directing him toward war, "It isn't the first step that concerns me, but both sides escalating to the 4th or 5th step, and we don't go to the 6th because there's no one around to do so." At this point, the U.S. administration makes a risky move. Kennedy decides to ignore Khrushchev's second angrier letter, as promising to withdraw missiles from Turkey would show U.S. weakness and risk NATO alliances. The president decides to respond only to the first letter instead. Ignoring the existence of an official enemy demand in a crisis is definitely a bold move, but one that Kennedy feels will pay off. JFK also realizes that to preserve U.S. status and alliances, he has little other choice at this point. Little do the XCOM members know that JFK has also been secretly playing another hand this whole time. Perhaps to be expected from such a tight-knit family, JFK keeps his younger brother Robert F. Kennedy, just 36 years old at the time, as his most trusted advisor. As the missile crisis is escalating, RFK is functioning as the president's de facto chief of staff. Unbeknownst to the rest of XCOM members, while the team publicly drafts JFK's response to Khrushchev, a promise not to attack Cuba in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles, JFK has sent his younger brother on a mission. Robert F. Kennedy secretly meets with Soviet ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Dobrynin. He informs the ambassador that the U.S. will in fact remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey and that they were planning to do so anyway. However, he emphasizes the fact that for the sake of optics and alliances, this removal cannot be part of any public deal between the US and the Soviet Union. Dobrynin conveys the message to Khrushchev, who's already fearful of an imminent war between the two nuclear superpowers. Upon hearing the US will accept the Soviets' demands, even in secret, the Soviet premier decides to put an end to this crisis once and for all. At 10 a.m. on October 28th, Radio Moscow interrupts everything to make one of the most important announcements of the year, reading a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy. The Soviet Union will dismantle and remove all missiles from Cuba. Though Castro is angry with what he perceives as the Soviets backing down in the face of U.S. intimidation, most of the world breathes a sigh of relief. Back on American soil, Kennedy hears the message and responds in kind, promising to keep the peace in the Caribbean area and praising Khrushchev for his statesman-like decision. After a harrowing 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. The Soviet Union started dismantling their missiles, and on November 20th, after Kennedy was satisfied that all missiles had been removed, he ended the quarantine of Cuba. 6 months later, in April of 1963, the US removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, though the world wouldn't know this was part of the US-USSR pact for years. Since this part of the deal was kept a secret, Kennedy won praise for his resolution of the crisis, while Khrushchev ended up viewed as somewhat weaker, having given in to US demands in exchange for a simple reassurance of peace. However, one good effect of the crisis was the installation of a hotline between DC and Moscow to prevent another similar conflict from ever taking place. It's terrifying to think that were it not for a few moments of hesitation on the parts of Kennedy and Khrushchev, or the actions of one man on a submarine such as Vasily Arkhipov, the world could have erupted in nuclear war in October of 1962. Now that you learned the fascinating history of the week the world almost ended in nuclear war, go discover another incredible story, or check out this other video instead.